All right, so this week I would like to talk about all things technique, good technique, bad technique, what is technique, and a lot of the issues around the uh, quote science-based discussion when it comes to measuring these kinds of things and just all the problems, that we kind of can run into in the research and how that maybe is very different or distinct from the reality of training and talking about technique and training. And while I think all of the, theory-based stuff around technique is super interesting and the X's and O's of the mechanics stuff, I definitely want to at some point, just along this episode, get into maybe just more practically like how people can go about troubleshooting different techniques in different scenarios just to make it sort of practically applied and not just again this sort of more theoretical esoteric thing, because I think that these kinds of discussions in particular can be the ones that venture off into sort of no man's land, and it's easy to get stuck on definitions. So I'm gonna read this definition that I wrote down of technique, and I want you to tell me what you think of it. Okay. So kind of two major parts here. But the first part is that technique refers to the set of physical properties of an exercise's setup and execution that differentiates it from other exercises. And then as sort of a sub or a little bullet point underneath of that, I wrote that technique defines how and why you perform an exercise in a specific way, which makes it goal defined. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, Hearing this live for the first thing the first word that stood out to me that was like a question mark in my mind was the idea of setup, being part of technique. Like just intuitively, I think of like the setup and the technique as almost two distinct things. But you also
Mm,
use that idea, and that's not necessarily like right or wrong. It's just like what immediately the feeling that I get, when I hear technique. It's just like that idea of having a goal, I think is really, really important. We've moved from the word like, of your form to the idea of your technique. And then I'll often use the term execution. I'm not sure if the word execution was in that definition, but I almost look at, these as like distinct things where it's like form really doesn't fit, isn't like a great word for any of it. Form
mm.
is kind of like, the shape that something takes on.
Yeah. You're saying it's like it's too nebulous.
Yeah. I don't think that's the right word. I think we can break that down into like, some subcategories. And I look at maybe like technique and execution as two different things. Again, just kind of going off of like, you know, not necessarily a strict um, definition from a textbook or from any type of scientific perspective, because I don't think these things are well defined necessarily. I'm sure if we go to like ACSM or NSCA, there's probably some definitions, but I'm sure they're also leaving a tremendous amount of things out. So when I think of technique, I'm thinking of like a very specific goal and what we consider form or execution many times, and sort of again, that like visceral sense of right or wrong can be violated by the idea of technique. So
Mm,
the technique to accomplish a goal may in fact be what people consider really bad, form or execution, but it may be the most efficient way to accomplish that task. Or when we're looking for a muscular stimulus, maybe it isn't, efficiency necessarily that we're looking for. So the if I like I just picked up a package, from the concierge, and it's like the best, technique for me to get this like heavy chewy box full of dog food, onto the cart if I want to just, spare my back, is I'll put one half of it on the cart first and then just use that to lift the other half. Instead of like if I was trying to maximally recruit, my hamstrings, glutes, and erectors, like I would just bend down, hip hinge, pick up the entire box. But in this case, I want to do the least amount of work. So the best technique for me, to spare myself from that work was just to pick up one half of the box, lean it on the cart, and then use that to, sort of leverage the other half onto it.
Right, right. So technique being this thing that is goal defined will determine kind of the physical shape that you observe, and the physical shape that you observe may or may not be aligned with people's intuition about how that thing or those things should look. So for example, like a good or something that's fairly distinct across bodybuilding and powerlifting is like the technique of, let's say, like um a deadlift, where a lot of power lifters will be super, basically rounded through a lot of the thoracic spine, always pretty rigid through the maybe low thoracic spine and lumbar spine. And obviously they're, coming off of the ground, and they're doing that because those are the rules and that's the skill they have to perform. But someone who is maybe trying to maximize for hypertrophy would be a little bit more conscious about maybe almost making the distance between the bar and the hips longer. So maybe they keep their spine straighter, they don't touch the ground, maybe they keep their knees straighter. And that in particular is something that maximizes for stimulus in a local region of a muscle, rather than maximizing for weight on the bar and weight lifted. So the distinction there kind of being what the outcome, or what outcome are we sort of oriented toward, and then sort of reverse engineering from there.
And
So I'm Yeah, go ahead.
then I'll typically use the word execution once we have that goal in place. So it's like you've defined a technique, and then it's like, how well do you execute that? So that's usually like when I'm talking to a client, and where I think a lot of people might use the word form. That's where I typically use the word execution, because it's like we've set these parameters, the parameters being like, ideally, we've chosen the right exercise. We've set up that exercise well. We've set parameters for how I want you to do it, or the technique based on the goal. And then how well do you execute that within those parameters?
Yeah, so that's actually super interesting because you're almost referring to technique in um, a little bit more of a conceptual way, it seems like. And the execution piece is what the physical manifestation of the goal technique sort of looks like. Is that right? Okay, yeah. Yeah, because I was just, if you look up the definition of technique, it just says a way of carrying out a particular task, which is not necessarily the way that something looks, but someone could use it interchangeably with that. Okay, cool. So then we sort of, I wanted to, in some ways, recap the conversation that we were having this week about just kind of like the science-based conversation around technique. And the thing that it has sort of been repeated, over and over again, and for, a number of different years now. As you know, I used to be super deep into the powerlifting world, and this was something that some powerlifting coaches would say. They would say, there's no really one like good technique, and there's no sort of one way to do the deadlift. And I coach each of my clients based on where they're strongest and what they can sort of sustain long term. And I actually think that that's not necessarily like bad messaging, and that in a lot of cases is just like the end of one approach. Like, let me just take this person as an individual, and let me have a sort of more broad goal for this person, and let me see how they kind of manage it. But that's not really what they're saying in terms of the actual words, because when you say that there's no good or bad technique, you're not really, I think, appropriately defining any parameters for what might be more or less aligned with a particular goal. And in the context of hypertrophy, which is, I think, a vast majority of the people that listen to this podcast in particular, that's their primary goal. We know very well just that how very basic physics interact with our anatomy, and we can just sort of very simply break those things down, and we can actually say this thing over here actually is, we'll say, mechanically more appropriate for this goal, as opposed to this thing over here, that you're doing as the alternative. So I do think that there are levels to this, and some levels are more gray and some levels can be more black and white. And it's just about defining in terms of this conversation, like which of the layers we're talking about. I think that's usually where most of this falls short. But anyhow, just to go back to the science-based thing, a lot of the research at this point doesn't necessarily point to or support rather this idea that, a specific kind of technique will lead to fewer rates of injury, or a specific kind of technique will lead to higher rates of injury. And I'm interested in what you said a couple days ago, but I'm sort of forgetting exactly how you said it, about just how these things can be very difficult to measure and sort of standardize for. So can you kind of rehash what you were saying to me a couple days ago about that?
Yeah, I think the main concept here is just being able to subcategorize who we're talking about. You know, so if we're looking at, for example, we're often talking about research in hypertrophy. When you're looking at the subjects in a study, they're going to define, like, are these subjects male or female? Are they young or old? Are they trained or untrained? And we begin to subcategorize them more and more. And as we gain more knowledge on a specific subject, we can further differentiate between, which of those subcategories makes a difference. So again, in hypertrophy research, now we might even see people subcategorized by the amount of volume they're doing prior to a study. So someone, comes into a study and maybe they're randomized into two different groups, a low volume group and a high volume group. And for an untrained person, it might not matter so much, but there would be no way to subcategorize this. But for a trained person, you might want to know, where was this person coming from, and that defines everything.
Right.
So that's a huge point to make here: is where is this person coming from? Is this a person, in this particular case, who has prior pain? If they have pain, for example, you say, Ethan, today I have head pain, right? And I go, well, do you have head pain because you just like ran into a doorway? Do you have head pain because you have a headache? Do you have head pain because you have a harpoon through the side of your head? Like, you have, like, we could subcategorize head pain into so many different things. You would never just say this is a head pain study.
Yeah, right, right.
The same thing here. This is a knee pain study. This is a back pain study. We need to be able to subcategorize and say, like, who is this person? Why do they have pain? Or, what is their prior history? And then, the morphology, like, of the person, like, is this an NFL lineman? Is this a ballerina? All these things really matter in context. Is this, someone who's really strong, someone who's really weak, someone who's trying to, win a world championship, or someone, who has zero, sort of scars behind them in regards to training history. So I think anytime you don't properly subcategorize things, it can be really difficult to see, a meaningful effect, because you're just looking. Um, you're just sort of seeing gray.
Yeah, so that's sort of one way in which the extraction or extrapolation that people do can be problematic, like on social media. So you have a specific study that says, you know, half of this group lifted with this posture on the deadlift, and half the group lifted with this posture, and there were no differences whatsoever in outcomes of pain, and both groups got better, or whatever, something like that. People will take something like that and they'll take one sentence from the conclusion and it'll say there's no difference between these two postures in this particular scenario for pain and rehab in this population. And of course, what people will take that as is, oh, okay, so it doesn't really matter, how I perform this task, whether I do it more rounded or whether I do it more straight back, either way is fine, because they look similar enough, and whichever I prefer is the right way to go. And I think that that is not a good place to arrive. Uh, if you are someone, especially who maybe has had an injury history and you do have certain sensitivities, I think that a good place to start is, well, maybe we go there a little bit later. But I think that's sort of one category of where this goes wrong, where there's a specific study which has a specific population and it had specific goals. And this is, I think, through no fault of the researchers necessarily, right? I think a lot of this interaction between research and social media was just born of just both of those things existing at the same time. And I think researchers make research for other researchers and not for social media. And it's unfortunate that I think a lot of people have demonized research in certain ways. And I want to make it clear that like that's not what we're doing. We're more so just maybe pointing out, or I'm more so just pointing out the problems in the distillation that I think leads to a sort of confusion around these topics. So that's one way of these things get muddied, is just that distinction. Another way is a situation in which there's a study that is completely unrelated to like a lifting based context. So for example, just sort of sticking with the theme of, the rounded back versus the straight back, there was this big study, which I know that you know about, that was done however many years ago on like thousands and thousands of like manual labor workers or people who were like picking up boxes, and like a certain percentage of the group it was like squat versus stoop test lifting or something like that, where half of the group would like bend over and we just round at their spine, not really thinking about, picking up boxes. And then the other half would basically like do a squat where they were very sort of knees forward, back straight sort of a thing. And the conclusion that was taken from that was that there were effectively no differences between pain between the groups or something like that. And so that's maybe whether that or not that's 100% accurate is not really the point. The point is just that if there's a study done in a particular context that is completely unrelated to the context that you are talking about or debating about or trying to figure out, okay, what is the good technique to use in this particular case, then you probably should not use the study that is completely contextually unrelated to what you're doing in terms of, the magnitude of the forces, the direction of those forces, the implements that you're using, obviously the amount of volume that you're doing and all that stuff too. So I think those are two sort of major categories. One is like maybe the context is pretty similar in terms of, maybe they're looking at a deadlift specifically in different deadlift techniques, but then the population and the prescription is very different. And then another setting is sort of where the context is completely different, but all of a sudden we can make this comparison because everyone is a person and people have spines and people can mimic similar positions. So I think those are sort of two major categories. Is there anything that you want to say about either of those two things before we maybe get more practical?
Yeah, I mean, because anytime there's an area of research where it really impacts someone financially, there's just going to be more resources put towards it. So, for example, in this area of like work economy, missed days of work, like that's a pretty big thing for places like, a Ford Motor Company to put money towards. It's just like, how do we reduce, whether it be sick time or whether it be, injuries, whether it be like the speed at which, someone can, put together a car. Like these things are really important, to these Fortune 500 companies. And they put a lot of money towards figuring this stuff out. And there are a good amount of studies looking at just like how do we improve efficiency? How do we reduce pain when someone, for example, is like, you know, lifting a bumper and putting it, onto an assembly line or something like that. And I think there are a number of studies that just like counter that idea that it doesn't matter for workers to care about their technique or when they're given when a machine is able to do a certain task and that takes some of the load, off of the workers and, some sort of support. They all in some way seem to support the idea of like psychosocial factors being somewhat important as well. It's just like how they perceive how much their boss likes them, for example. Um, but I'm sure there are studies going in both directions, but I think it's just important to state that like it's not ubiquitous that studies just support the idea that it doesn't matter how workers are lifting things like boxes in the workplace when they're doing repetitive tasks. Um, they a lot of these places specifically have someone on staff that's like, an expert in ergonomics, to set up their workstations in a way that's either, most efficient or least injurious.
Okay, yeah, that is something I was completely unaware of. That's an
And then,
interesting
and then
occupation.
they just look at over the course of years, like how much money does that save them? Insurance companies, try to do the same thing. Um,
Have you heard about this? Is somewhat of a sidebar, but have you heard about the company where there's like a mandatory lift for all employees midday? I forget exactly what the company does, but the requirements are that there's a mandatory lift kind of like in the middle of the day, and that most employees have a six pack.
never heard of that.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up on that next week, and I'll get more information about that. Um,
I
did
know
I
there was
did
a big,
were you gonna say something else?
I know there was like a study that lasted a year or so with like the Pensacola Fire Department as well, where they looked at the way they were performing like firefighting tasks, like, being able to break down a door, being able to like, run with a hose, like, a lot of shit, like, whether it be money or whether it be, saving someone's life, things that, we're willing to invest a lot of money towards and a lot of time and resources towards because they really matter versus like, you know, something like increasing your bench press one
Mhm.
arm. We have like really low sample sizes, like really short duration studies, really low funding. Um, and they actually had one group train with coaches from Exos, what used to be called Athletes Performance, and they were like the technique group essentially, and then the other group basically do CrossFit.
Nice.
And they did that for like a year, and then afterwards like measured them in these firefighting tasks and used sort of like standards for positions that were considered like injurious from say like an ACL perspective or a low back perspective, um, and then just like followed those firefighters afterwards, and it seemed to matter in terms of being taught technique even outside of those tasks. So they never trained them on the firefighting tasks, but they in the gym they were just teaching them like how to properly deadlift, how to properly squat, like that that idea of like efficiency of moving from point A to point B with like the least amount of mechanical work when you have to do a repetitive task. With all these things, like I listen to lots of good podcasts. Like this morning, I was listening to one by the guys at Data Driven Strength, and those guys are researchers. When they talk about studies like this, they cite them. They talk about the statistics. Like, I would tell people like, look, when I mention a study and I'm just breezing over it and I'm just giving kind of like, some high level thoughts, take it for what it's worth. Like, I'm not citing it. I'm not giving the stats on it. I'm not a researcher, but these are just like, from listening to other people that I respect, from going over reading the studies with, you know, whatever degree of experience that I, personally haven't being able to interpret that. These are just the conclusions and artifacts, that I've sort of pulled out of them.
Yeah, so so let's move on to some practical recommendation type stuff because I think this is something that it's certainly not generalizable. And but at the same time, I think that there maybe are some good guidelines that we could potentially provide around specific techniques in different cases. And I think maybe a good place to start is just um, trying to be as precise as you can be with what you're trying to do. Because I feel like a lot of times when you ask people that question, like, what are you trying to do with this exercise? The answer is either overly vague or there's just not really an answer at all. Like, this is, if I'm doing a pull down, it's like, this is a back thing. And maybe that's like sufficient to some degree, but, it's very difficult to define the goal of back if you're doing a pulling type of motion. So and I kind of struggle to sort of navigate this conversation without getting super like jargony and specific about like anatomy based things and physics based things. So was there a place that maybe came to mind for you in terms of where you would start with just the more generalized conversation of um, how someone can maybe go about finding appropriate technique for them, after, of course, they have some degree of direction or some degree of aim in which they can, sort of start to move.
That's an interesting question. So the situation is like someone has decided they're going to do a particular exercise, maybe because like they saw it, on your page, or someone else told them like, hey, if you, want to build big lats, you should do a lat pull down or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
There they're saying like, well, what's the most quote unquote optimal way for me to perform that? And then how might they like, troubleshoot, whether or not they're sort of moving towards optimality in that.
Yeah, yeah, because to know whether or not they're doing that, there's some degree of, like, you just need to understand the anatomy. There's not necessarily a way around that.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, that is a tough question to answer,
Because
especially when you're just coming from, a place of like relative ignorance, and really what you have to go by is sensation, which is going to be extremely limited. And I think most people would agree that if something is painful, and not in the way of like, oh, I got a really big pump, but something feels painful in a way that is overly threatening, and you can identify as like this is a bad kind of pain. I think we can at least start there and say like, all right, when it comes to hypertrophy, you have a lot of options, to accomplish the task of stimulating the chemical signaling cascade, and that'll ultimately result in muscle growth. There's a lot of ways to get there in terms of the exercise selection, setup, and execution. um so that one I can at least say like, all right, I think people are going to like generally agree like, don't just repetitively do something that's causing you pain. And then from there we can start to get a little bit more specific of like, well, how do we then identify like, if I could be doing this in a way that would you know um be more effective, for my goal of stimulating XYZ. And then maybe it gets more specific. So if we say, all right, I'm doing a pull down, and then we use the word lat pull down, maybe now we could say like, well, is this exercise, going to be more specific to the lat? Like, is the lat going to be, the thing that fails when I get to the end of this exercise? And then maybe even, are these specific fibers of the lat going to be a little bit more differentiated? And then now we start to get into the territory of a lot of disagreement, where people
Mhm.
would say like, look, this is not this has not been sort of like parsed out in the research. Like, we don't know, uh you know if this exercise even differentiates these fibers more, and even if it does, if that's relevant, like maybe you could just get enough stimulus doing something broadly, so we don't really know the magnitude, we don't know exactly the direction. So this is where you start to get into a little bit of ambiguity, and you start to maybe have to use uh, other proxies that are at least like reasonable. And
Yeah,
I think that's where you get with like, there is at the end of the day like only so much that we really know when you do anything. Like when I walk over to my stove, like I don't really know what makes that, flame come out. I'm like, all right, there's some gas. Like, but anything as I look around my house, like I couldn't just make that, myself. And if I asked why 10 times, like I would get to a place with anything that I can see in front of me that I don't understand. Um, but we still have to live our life and make decisions. So you have to have some process of, uh, some like rational stepwise process to say like, okay, this is, um, this is the logical conclusion that I've come to, and I'm going to go from there. Like the idea that everything should be supported, with a study, and in a study that ultimately, in research, we're setting out to prove things wrong, not necessarily come to a conclusion. So even if you have, a bunch of studies that point in a given direction, that could change, next week, and there's, 5 layers under that we're not yet aware of. So we're never certain about anything. We're really just, making a best guess. So, I'll kind of pass that over to you as in terms of like, okay, we've gotten to this point where, yes, things are a little gray in terms of what we know for sure, but the reality is that's the case everywhere. And how can we at least make an informed decision and something that's, unlikely to be more negative than it is positive?
Yeah, that's a really great comparison, especially just like with, at the stove or even just, us communicating through Zoom. Like, we don't need to know how Zoom works to know that Zoom is working for us, kind of a thing, in some ways. And, you mentioned sensation and discomfort early on, and I kind of want to just go back to that for a second. I think that sensation is obviously very, very important. And people, who have conditions where they don't experience appropriate sensations don't tend to live very long for, hopefully obvious, reasons. If something is wrong, generally you feel something that you can categorize as uncomfortable or as having some measure of discomfort. And, generally speaking, we know when stuff feels good or at least away from not good, So I think that's, as you mentioned, a really good starting point, which is, just general things like, do I feel this in the muscle that I'm thinking that I'm training? That's probably a decent proxy in most scenarios. Are there scenarios in which, you can really be cranking yourself in the wrong direction and also feel something powerfully, stretched or something? Yes, but I find those scenarios to be few and far in between. Um, as you're doing the sets and you're fatiguing, do you feel a sensation of fatigue and sort of burning in that tissue? That's probably not a bad sign. After the sets, do you feel some measure of like fatigue in the area, like, oh, that thing just worked, and maybe I have a little bit of a pump there? That's also probably a good sign. And although those things, as we're saying, are more subjective in nature, I think those are not bad tools to utilize in a scenario in which maybe you're not 100% certain about, the anatomy and the architecture and the differences in the architecture and the force stuff and all that stuff. So I think that's a really good starting place. I think that maybe in terms of practical application to troubleshooting, okay, what do I do when something isn't comfortable, is a good place to go now. And, I think it's a really good idea. And, you and I had discussed this plenty. I'm not sure about on the podcast, but just trying to narrow the scope of the range that you're using, or narrow the degrees of range that you're using, so that you're sort of staying away from the extremes, right? Because the extremes, generally speaking, are where people tend to feel not so good stuff, whether that be in, the fully stretched position of an exercise or the fully lengthened position, or the fully shortened in some cases, where there's more joint stacking. Generally speaking, I think where people feel the safest and where they feel the most connection to the tissues that they're training tends to be in the sort of middle of the range. So in the instance of a pull down, let's say I had someone in the Discord community post up a video of them doing like a single arm pull down. And they also posted this image of, an arrow pointing to like the space between their scaps and sort of like also where their teres are. So, kind of like rhomboid teres area, just like bad. They were getting a bad sensation of that area. And kind of what I noticed was this tendency for them to get sort of shrugged up super high, maybe beyond what we could call active control or active range. And what would happen as soon as they started to initiate the pull down is their torso would sort of lean back for their arm to be able to move down. So I think that's actually a little bit of a good clue for not just a pull down, but for all exercises, is whenever you see motion that you think is unrelated to the moving joints, I would take that as a sign that your body is trying to move you somewhere else in order for you to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. So another good example might be when you see people's legs, people's femurs rolling inward and outward a ton on like a leg extension. Oftentimes people sit down on a leg extension with their feet and their legs sort of pointed outward. And if you just sort of haphazardly get into a leg extension and start kicking up on the pad, your body and your brain will roll your legs inward so that your knee can actually push against the pad, right? Because your knee can't push against the pad if they're facing, out toward the side. So I think another good way to think about this is if you see the unwanted motion, you know that something is happening that your body and your brain is sort of organizing around for you to accomplish that task. So if you do have a goal in mind, and even if you don't understand the nuances of the anatomy, you can at least understand which joints you're trying to move and which joints you're not trying to move. So rather than sort of trying to shave it down to the nuanced muscular level, just keeping things at the level of the bones and the joints, I think is actually a really good place for most people to go and maybe to stay, where we just say, okay, I'm trying to move this joint and I'm trying to train this particular resistance direction. And if I see things that are not those things, if I see things that are not shoulder extension and a pull down, if I see things that are not just pure knee extension and flexion in a leg curl or a leg extension, then I know that I'm in some kind of position that I maybe want to adjust out of, or maybe sort of play around with, certain kinds of cues to limit that motion. So I think just starting from desired motion and undesired motion, just trying to identify what desired motions are, and then trying to sort of stay within the zone where those desired motions are the only things that are occurring. And to the conversation of avoiding the extremes, I think the extremes, as in that pull down example where that person is maybe getting yanked a little bit too high, the extremes are the places where we tend to see more of those undesired motions occurring. So in something like a pull down where we see a lot of trunk motion, or maybe just a lot of weird rotation occurring through the arm, that may be, again, something that could potentially cause discomfort. Those things are sort of one and the same to me, where if we can just use a portion of the range that we're really, really locked in with what we do want to move and what we don't want to move, then that's probably a pretty good sign that we're in the ballpark of something that is going to be, good technique for that particular goal. So did you have anything to sort of add to that or interject?
Yeah, a bunch of things kind of swirled around in my head there. I guess just coming back to, the start of this topic, this idea that like you still need to start with some conceptual framework, like the criticism that like this has not been directly studied, in research. Um, I think there are so many assumptions we make, that are not directly studied in research and we just kind of take for granted. And then to say that like these other things, we shouldn't use proxy measures for these other things, or we shouldn't, test these out, or like um, that it's, that these concepts are irrelevant because they haven't, been directly tested. I think we forget just how many things we take for granted. Like, for example, like, do we really like have we really directly looked at like whether the back squat is or isn't the best exercise for pec hypertrophy? Like, do we know that? Like, have we taken like muscle biopsies like after back squats and been like, this is or isn't, a good exercise for pecs? Like, maybe there's some EMG stuff or whatever, but we really have like direct high quality research to say that like a back squat isn't the best bicep or pec exercise. Like, I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably not.
I mean, a lot of powerlifters develop some biceps related issues on back squats. So, you never know.
And there was
Maybe
certainly
some
a time where
tension there.
if you asked, like the average meathead, like, is doing big compound exercises like could squats potentiate my arm growth. There was a time where like the hormone hypothesis for hypertrophy was really popular,
Yeah.
and say like, yeah, just doing big compound exercises and really fucking yourself up is going to drive hormones higher, and thus your arms are going to grow, as long as you're training them to some degree. And also just like um looking at the basic mechanics or like physics of anything else, in our life. If I walk outside and I pick up a stick and I want to break this stick, like there is a better and worse way to break this stick. The idea that that wouldn't apply to your body as well. Like I wouldn't walk out and try to pull the stick apart from top to bottom. Like, there's a pretty intuitive way that you never like, really had to be taught. You can just kind of observe, other things in life, and you figure out how to break that stick by the age of like, 2. Um,
Yeah.
so I can't help but think that the same is going to apply to any other physical structure, and there are better and worse ways, to apply force to that structure, for a given goal. Um, some of the other things that came to mind while you were talking there, um, when we're talking about like shortened versus lengthened bias exercises, whether that be from the perspective of the joint or whether that be from the perspective of where the highest degree of resistance or torque is, sometimes it's used interchangeably with this idea of like stretch mediated hypertrophy, where there are studies, like for example in the calves, where they're having people in a stretched position, for an hour plus on end, and they're seeing some degree of muscle growth that may be comparable, to doing some sets, of resistance training, for that muscle throughout the week. And I think sometimes that gets carried over to training in a way that is not wholly positive. So, for example, like what you were describing with like the pull down, oftentimes people will get into a position, relax in that position, and aim for the sensation of stretch. So, whether it be a pull down where it's like, okay, the goal is for my hand to travel, the implement to travel as far towards, the ceiling, on a pull down as I can. And the best way to travel more distance at some point is to relax. Or that could be, for example, like on a leg extension, at the bottom where it's like, you're not really, maintaining active control. At some point, like maybe something else moves, or maybe I just lose control and I let the machine pull me into a position. And oftentimes the sensation when they get there is this feeling of I am being stretched, so if I were to do, like what would look like a quad stretch, and I put my foot behind me on a chair or something, and I knee flex, I bend my knee, I feel a stretch in my quad. If I use my body weight to just fall into that position, I'll get that sensation of stretch. But I could be in the same position, what looks the same on the outside, and I could push my foot down into that chair behind me. Um, and then we wouldn't necessarily call that like, oh, I'm being stretched anymore. Now I'm contracting, even though I'm in the same position. My experience is that when we are resistance training, we want to be contracting, whether that's eccentrically or concentrically. I don't typically see good results, whether that be from an output standpoint, as far as just like doing more total work, getting more reps, or oftentimes, as you described, from a discomfort standpoint, when people seek out the idea of being stretched versus, contracting eccentrically and lengthening, eccentrically a muscle as far as they can control.
Yeah, and to the point of output there, I think that something that makes a skill more difficult to learn or progress is trying to navigate that transition between relaxing and contracting, right? So where people will like really slump up their shoulders in, a pull down or something, which isn't necessarily bad on its own. But if, done in a sort of relaxed position, they have to be able to manage that transition from being pulled to then pulling, right? And sort of going in and out of that every single rep, and trying to sort of go through that process of, tension primarily in these tissues versus the contractile tissues. I think that's something that is, I hadn't really thought about that in terms of the skill component and how different that can be. So, for example, in that instance of the person who was, experiencing the discomfort on the pull down, the first thing that I said was just lower the angle. So try to be less extreme with it, and try to, in that, top position, just be a little bit more aware of maintaining, some degree of pulling down, while you're still moving upward. to that concept of control, just always sort of trying to act in the direction that is opposite the resistance that you're using. That kind of being, a very broad definition maybe of what control might be. And just maintaining that, whether again, like you said, you are acting against the load or sort of moving in the direction of it. Another good example, just to maybe solidify the visual of what I'm trying to describe with the extremes and the desired motion versus the undesired motion. If someone's doing like a curl, for example, and they're maybe doing a preacher curl, this is one we commonly see where, maybe people are pretty good at keeping the shoulder stable and sort of unmoving, the shoulder girdle unstable and unmoving on the way up. But on the way down, a lot of times what happens is the whole shoulder kind of, anteriorly tips or sort of gets, shoved into this protraction thing on the way down. And then that usually leads to sort of more rocking back and forth. So an example maybe in that particular scenario of not, necessarily starting with the extremes would be like if you were to sort of just use the middle of the curl where you are, quote, keeping tension on the biceps, quote unquote. That would be a fairly decent place to start with, yourself or, if you're working with someone, just to sort of stay in that mid-range zone where there's going to be less of an extreme change in length. And as a consequence of that, less of an extreme change in terms of the directions that your body needs to coordinate. So in some ways, it's kind of just decreasing complexity to then sort of expand the horizon of that complexity, maybe eventually. But to be honest, I see no problem with at the moment people just using ranges of motion that they feel comfortable and confident controlling. I don't ever see this like super big necessity to like, maximize the stretch on every exercise and maximize the shorten position on every exercise. I just don't think that's something that is as relevant as just being able to consistently set up and execute something in a standardized way, in a way that is comfortable and repeatable, longer term. Um, I posted this thing yesterday to the point of this conversation. Uh, and I was actually surprised by how extreme the response was. It was just the story. It was a video of me doing a pendulum squat. And um, on the pendulum squat, I was basically, I wasn't using like a wedge. So I didn't have, the heel elevation relative to the platform. And I was basically just going down maybe, you know, to my max hip flexion, which ended up looking something like 90 degrees, 100 degrees of hip flexion, maybe. And like a knee bent position, in which my hamstrings were approximating my calves, but not to the point that people are used to, where there's this like massive degree of folding, right? So it was basically like, to most people, it looked like it was this super partial half rep, type of thing. And to me, it's like it felt super good. I basically just like stayed in the mid range. There was a really good balance of like glute and quad with it. And there are zero things that for me were wrong about that for me. And I just simply asked the question, and this was like just through a story, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does this range of motion bother you? And you would be surprised by the amount of people, and maybe it's somewhat of a leading question, but there were like I would say probably 70 or 80% of people said something like 11, or 200. And some people, I think, if I'm familiar with them, were kind of just fucking around with me. But a lot of people were completely serious, and I would ask them why, like, why is that, why is this not good? And they would say something along the lines of like, well, we know that you need to like maximize stretch to maximize hypertrophy, or if you're not going to the bottom, then you're wasting XYZ amount of this set, and just things like that. So I think to your point about assumptions, a lot of the objections to seeing something like that kind of pendulum squat, which by the way, to any normal person would be like, yeah, that's a great squat. Um, um, a lot of those objections are underlined by all these different assumptions that people extract from sound bites they've heard from, bits of research. So if there's any commentary on that from you, just in terms of that response from people, and maybe what you would say to something like, oh, if you're not using this full range of motion, then you're not maximizing stretch. And if you're not maximizing stretch, because that might be an obvious objection to this conversation we're having about, sort of playing with the middle ground. Um, what sort of maybe counterpoints would you make to that whole avoiding the extremes sort of a thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think first of all, the research on lengthened partials or stretch mediated hypertrophy, like it is 100% in its infancy. The idea that like we have this figured out and we know the mechanisms and we know for sure that it's just like better across all cases and that just like more is better. We have so little context for all of that right now. It's really just like a soundbite type of thing. And it's interesting because, science communication right now, evidence-based practice, like, just growing at such a rapid rate that, the average like 16-year-old kid at the gym, like it just has access to these sound bites where maybe like 10 years ago, it was such a niche thing. These ideas that are still very much in their infancy are just getting propagated so fast, much faster than the people studying them actually have confidence in them. Like this is just, it's an early idea. It's interesting. It's supported by anecdote, but we can't just extrapolate this, to all cases. And there are so many other things that we know are important. This one thing that is just kind of like we're now starting to shed light on and seems to show some promise is not worth just like making the number one priority. And the pendulum always swings, right? Like 100% you can walk into any gym and you can see people doing, quarter squats where they could have put on, a third of the weight and they could have traveled more distance and potentially like got a better stimulus to sort of risk, stimulus, to negative consequences, for doing that exercise. And that'd be very valid. It'd be a very valid assumption. You wouldn't necessarily know that. You don't know who the person is coming in. You don't know what their prior history is. It's safe to say if you see that same 16-year-old kid 10 years ago and he's got 300 pounds on the bar and he's going down a third of the way, it's safe to say he's probably doing that for ego and not just like some sound reasoning. Um, but there are other times where you might, for example, see like a sprinter doing that, or a basketball player doing that. And there might actually be a really sound reason for it. And there may be a place and time. I'm not saying that that automatically carries over to, the average gym bro, but we have to be able to, contextualize these things and also understand the magnitude of them. Like, I don't think any of the people that are commenting, most of the people commenting could tell you like, well, what's like, what's the effect size, like what's the magnitude of difference that we see between the two. And especially like, when we're talking about the difference between, something that's we're talking about indirectly, so for example, like there's the idea that, some of the earlier studies looking at like full range of motion versus partial range of motion were not differentiated into what part of the range we were talking about. So in general, you would see like full range of motion was better than partial range of motion, but they hadn't yet broken it up into this idea of partial range of motion where. And
Mhm.
then, more recently, we've broken it up into the idea of like, okay, maybe it matters where the partial range of motion is. So maybe in some cases, partial range of motion, in a more lengthened position, is better than, a short position, or maybe sometimes even better, than a full range of motion. But, just like this, volume versus like intensity of effort discussion, like, you know, how many sets of failure equal how many sets not to failure of a given exercise? Is it if I do 4 sets to failure, it's worth 6 sets, with 2 reps in reserve? How many sets of going full range of motion is worth not going full range of motion? Does it just take, one more set, and what's the potential risk for a given exercise in a given person, again, once we subcategorize people, of maybe going deeper into that range, where it gets more difficult, to control on certain exercises. So it just all really has to be contextualized, and I think the magnitude of these changes sometimes can get really exaggerated. And then you can also just look in practice, at people that are going through quote unquote like partial ranges of motion on certain exercises, still getting really great results. And, a lot of the people commenting on how terrible these things are, don't have half of the results, of the people doing the partial stuff. And obviously there's a lot of different influences that go into, what gets someone results. But I think we can't just immediately overstate like the importance of it without paying attention to the other factors that are also influencing the sort of risk to reward.
Yeah. And oftentimes, in order to have the conversation to begin with, we have to eliminate thinking about all these other variables that have an influence, right? Like, for example, resistance direction, which is something that just continues to come up over and over and over in this conversation where, you may end up using more range of motion that is completely unloaded for the particular goal that you're trying to accomplish, in which case it would be like, why are you moving into a position that's unloaded, right? It doesn't, it kind of falls apart uh most of the time just at that level of questioning. So yeah, I think that's a really good place maybe to put a stop on this discussion. I think that we could probably continue to find more things about maybe how to sort of lay out and troubleshoot the good technique type of thing. But I think that was a pretty good practical direction that we took there. Unless there's anything else that you wanted to say about maybe other than what we discussed in terms of just general troubleshooting things that people can do. Maybe the only other thing that I would say is just especially in the context of upper body stuff, this mostly applies because with lower body stuff, just inherently you're limited in how many things that you can use, and then as a consequence of you not having hands and stuff like that, on your lower body, like where you have feet but they can't really grab stuff, you're going to be limited in terms of just how freely your lower body can move and be loaded. But in terms of upper body stuff, I think a really good place to go if you are someone that maybe is struggling with figuring out how to set up a particular motion, is just to move more in the direction of like, and not permanently, but just kind of starting with things that maybe are more forgiving in terms of, maybe using a cable instead of a dumbbell if you can. Even something like a dumbbell, which is, free moving and you can sort of adjust yourself around, still is much more limited in its ability to adjust to you. Which, in terms of cables, obviously they had their downsides because although you can be, more precise with cables and they can adjust to you, that kind of comes at the cost of not being constrained to do anything necessarily, right? Like if you set up a chest press, where do you set the bench? Where do you set the height of the cables? Those are things that, you kind of have to calculate based on, a vision that you have. Whereas if you just get into a chest press machine, you kind of have this fixed path that you're already, sort of determined to use. So it's tricky to say which of those two things might be more beneficial, but generally speaking, I find people tend to have more issues with the things that are overly fixed as opposed to the things that are more free moving. So if you have the option, a recommendation from me might just be see how the things that are more free moving feel and just play around with what positions feel more comfortable. And then you can kind of extrapolate from those exercises which positions and which loading directions maybe feel a little bit better for you. And then you can determine, okay, which machines might be more similar to that thing as opposed to the other way around where, you spend all this time trying to find an appropriate machine, but then you can't sort of visualize, okay, how does this machine and these angles, how does that apply to this thing over here that's, more in a cable scenario? So just kind of being willing to maybe experiment more with things that are more free moving and that give you more adjustability, I think is not a bad idea, especially if it's just maybe more for, like a warm up type thing. I think it's good to, be open to just playing around with stuff, especially if you're someone who has had prior, injury history, or just as someone who, if you're someone who experiences discomfort on a regular basis. So anything else to add or subtract from that?
Yeah, I'll just try to give some takeaways of like working with the population that most likely is listening to this podcast, which isn't like that, 16-year-old kid in the gym who's just, doing partial rep squats at the top. There are some like very common things that just I end up, correcting when I'm watching videos or when people come in to train with me in person, more on like a consultation basis. So just some things off the top of my head. One of them would be, that idea that we're broadly talking about here, which is like how far is the implement traveling versus like what joint are we trying to move through? And oftentimes what I'll see is, another joint will move. So for example, like on the leg press, I may be watching their spine position as they try to move, that leg press as far as possible. So they may be trying to maximize knee flexion or hip flexion. And then I'll watch, at the bottom of the rep, their, back come off the pad, their lower back round, whether you believe that's, negative or neutral, in regards to your risk for back pain. I do see out of that position, they're oftentimes very weak as well. And that ultimately seems to limit output. Because a lot of times what happens is the rhetoric becomes like, well, if I can use less load, that's going to be more, beneficial from an orthopedic standpoint. And I think that misses the idea of like one of just pork. Number one, that like load is not the only thing that's impacting the amount of like stress on a given segment. It's also like distance plays a big role in that as well. But then also like what's moving, like you said, there's the resistance direction in terms of like what's being challenged, and then there's ultimately like what's being held stable and what's moving. And just being able to properly use a restraint, whether it be the pad underneath your elbow when you're doing that preacher curl that you described, whether it be a seat belt, a back pad, a thigh pad on a leg extension leg curl, whether it be trying to set up like a chest pad for a row, knee pad, or like an angled chest pad for a pull down. The ability to like push into something and keep what you want from moving stable, to keep certain things stable and other things moving that you want to move, I think is a key concept. And just identifying, if you're watching a video of yourself, like, am I keeping contact with a restraint? Like, am I keeping contact in the places that I don't want to move, and really focusing not so much on the distance that I'm traveling, but am I just moving through the joint that I want to move? Other things, and people sort of in this population could be like when they could potentially use momentum. Like if there's an exercise where maybe there's not a good restraint, for example, like a pull down, and they're trying to maintain this idea of what they call like proper form. A lot of times it may just be moving like too slow concentrically. It may just be allowing for no momentum when the only way you're going to overcome, a profile where it's really hard, where you're weak, is at some point, to maybe use a little bit of juice, a little bit of swing, a little bit of just like a forceful intent more than anything else. And I do see that oftentimes with a crowd that's trying to sort of like maximize correct form, is sometimes they're just moving too slow and just like too hyper focused on the idea of like being able to feel every part of the range. And sometimes on the concentric, they just need a little bit more of a forceful intent. I mentioned that idea of like uh, controlling, the load eccentrically. And I think it's useful, like if you can even overload the eccentric, like if you have a partner and you're in a position where you guys both understand what you're trying to do, the person is, is properly trained. They're not a novice where it's going to be unsafe. And you can have a little bit of additional resistance on an eccentric, like whether that be a chest press machine and the partner's kind of like pushing back as you move eccentrically, or a pull down machine where they're kind of pushing down on the stack. I think just learning to really control that eccentric and those transition points where you can stop the weight and then change directions, I found that to be really valuable, again, from like an output standpoint, and just being able to use the target muscle throughout versus sort of relaxing and then changing your strategy as you're moving. And sometimes that gets people more output towards the end of a set, where it's like normally they'd relax and then go from like a relatively fast or moderately fast rep to just a rep that they absolutely get crushed on and it appears to be failure. And sometimes it reduces the load because they get sort of more specific in terms of like the actual tissues that they're training, and it's not just broadly spread out because they're changing their execution throughout the set. Again, that idea of technique. Maybe I'm using a specific technique to train, a given muscle, and I want to maintain that execution throughout. But if that execution changes as I fatigue, now it's really changing like the stated goal, and I'm moving that stress elsewhere. So I think those are some of the big things that just off the top of my head that I'll see in practice, when like someone's coming in for a consult on their training.
All right. Fantastic.